Hi everyone, welcome to yet another episode in our ongoing series, History of English Literature. Today we are going to talk about the 16th century, as you can see. And I would like to start by saying that if you haven't seen the previous videos which cover the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman, as well as the Middle English period, I highly recommend that you do that right now. And then once you're done with those videos, you're welcome to come back and continue watching the 16th century. But if this is what you want, of course, let's get down to business. So today we're going to talk about a period of English literature between 1485 to 1603. The 16th century in England was a time of great change. At the beginning of this period, Britain was seen as a wild, kind of remote place by people in Europe, especially European cities like Venice, Madrid, and Paris. And the English language also had very little prestige, if any. And so important works of literature like Thomas More's Utopia, for instance, were written in Latin because it was a more prestigious language. However, by the end of the century, English had become a powerful, expressive medium, and writers like Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare created their works in English because they knew that they had the audience and that English was now developed enough to be able to accommodate their great works of literature. This transformation happened through the creativity of brilliant writers and many other smaller creative acts driven by various motives. And so the development of the English language was connected with the strengthening of the English state, the growth of the printing industry, religious reformation, and of course a new sense of national identity. And we will talk about all of that in this video. Okay, let's go on and talk about the court and the city. The 16th century saw the establishment of the Tudor dynasty from 1485 to 1603, which brought stronger central authority to England after the Wars of the Roses. The royal court became not just a center of power, but also a center for culture. So court entertainments, fashions, and tastes shaped the imagination of the whole country. Culture and power were closely connected. Even simple lyrics could be carefully crafted displays of skill by aspiring courtiers. Now, during this time, London's population also grew dramatically from 60,000 in 1520 to almost 400,000 people a century later, making it Europe's largest and fastest growing city. The introduction of printing by William Caxton in the late 1400s also made books cheaper and more available, increasing literacy rates in the country. However, manuscripts still had prestige among the elites, and those who had associations with the court still preferred to read Latin works of literature. However, as we said, a lot of people started believing in the power of the English language, and so towards the end of the century, we have more and more writers who actually believe in the power that lied beneath the English language. Let's continue talking about one of the most important things that happened in this century, and that's Renaissance humanism. During the 15th century, a few English officials had traveled to Italy and had witnessed the Renaissance, which was a rebirth of arts and letters inspired by classical antiquity. This movement valued the achievements of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers over medieval Christian theology. It emphasized curiosity, individual self-assertion, and the idea that humans were the measure of all things. That's the humanist part of it. In England, the Renaissance found expression primarily through humanism, as I said, which was an intellectual program focused on the educational reform. Humanists like Erasmus and Thomas More challenged the narrow scholastic education, and they promoted instead a curriculum still based on grammar, logic, and rhetoric, but shifted the focus from the training for the church to acquiring general cultural knowledge. Latin, as I said, remained central to education, though some students also learned Greek. And so this classical education was mainly available to boys. Girls were typically educated at home and rarely received training in ancient languages and literature. Another important thing that happened in this period was the Reformation. Let's talk about that. At the beginning of the 16th century, England had one official religion, Catholicism, with the Pope as the head. The Catholic Church structured people's lives from birth to death with a system of ceremonies, confessions, and rituals, giving power to the unmarried male clergy over their largely illiterate followers. Religious change, however, began in 1517 when Martin Luther challenged church practices in Germany. Luther promoted direct access to the Bible through vernacular translations and emphasized personal faith over ritualistic observances. In England, however, the Reformation started with political motives. For example, Henry VIII wanted a divorce from Catherine to marry Anne, but the Pope refused. However, he did not give up. This led Henry to break with Rome and declare himself the head of the Church of England in 1534, thereby giving himself the authority to declare the divorce and finalize it, and then marry Anne. The monasteries were dissolved as a result of Henry declaring himself the head of the England Church, and their wealth was seized by the crown. Religious upheaval continued throughout the century, with England swinging from Catholicism to Protestantism several times as monarchs changed. You can't really talk about the 16th century literature without talking about Elizabeth. And so the next topic that we're going to discuss, as you can see, is Elizabeth as a female monarch in a male world. When Elizabeth I became queen in 1558, there was widespread belief that women were unsuited to rule men. Many thought that women lacked capacity for rational thought and were led only by emotions. To counter these prejudices, Elizabeth's defenders appealed to historical precedent and legal theory, including the concept of the king's two bodies, the idea that while her natural body was female, her body politique, so to speak, was perfect and beyond gender. Elizabeth assembled trusted advisors, but also made crucial decisions with the help of, those advisors. She trusted herself, though. She made crucial decisions herself. While she promoted the idea of royal absolutism, which was like trying to concentrate power in her own person, in reality, her power was limited by the parliament's control over taxation. She governed through political maneuvering, commanding presence and creating a cult of love among her followers, where courtiers approached her on their knees with extravagant compliments. She transformed her gender from a liability, because people did not trust a female to be the head of the country, but she changed that. She changed her gender from a liability into an asset, representing herself as both a mother to the nation and a semi-divine figure who could lead the country to prosperity. A lot happened really during this period. As you can see, the title of this next part of our presentation is going to be A Kingdom Besieged or The Kingdom in Danger. Elizabeth faced threats from the Catholic and the Protestant extremists throughout her reign. A particular danger came from her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had a claim to the English throne and whose presence in England caused anxiety about potential plots against Elizabeth. These fears intensified after Pope Gregory XIII declared in 1580 that assassinating Elizabeth would not be a mortal sin or a moral sin. The inevitable military confrontation with Catholic Spain also came after Mary's execution. In 1588, Philip II sent the Spanish Armada to invade England. The smaller but more maneuverable English fleet defeated the Armada, and storms destroyed many Spanish ships. Before the expected land invasion, Elizabeth appeared before the troops at Tilbury, declaring that, though she had the body of a weak and a feeble woman, quote unquote, she had, quote unquote, the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. This speech kind of showcases her theatrical command, rhetorical skill, and of course, her personal courage. A very important concept to talk about whenever we are discussing the 16th century is the definition of Englishness and its opposition to otherness. By the end of the Tudor period, English people had become much more aware of their national identity. They increasingly defined themselves in contrast to others, particularly Catholics after the Reformation, but also other groups, other minorities. London had many foreign residents, for instance, mainly artisans and merchants from Portugal, Italy, Spain, Germany, France, and the Netherlands. And though many were Protestant refugees given some protection by the government, there were repeated demonstrations and riots against foreign workers. There was also hostility towards the Welsh, the Scots, and specifically the Irish, whom the English had long tried to subdue. England's small African population also faced pseudo-scientific speculation about their skin color, though some blacks served in aristocratic households. English involvement in the slave trade officially kind of began in the 1560s, with John Hawkins officially transporting Africans to the Americas. So that was another important thing that happened during this period. English people tried to always define themselves in opposition to others. We are the complete opposite of all these people who look different, who talk differently, and who, in their opinion, were inferior. Let's now talk about the writers, the printers of the period, as well as the patrons of theater. The connection between literature and print was less direct in the 16th century than it is today. Poetry often circulated in manuscript form, copied into personal anthologies or reproduced by professional scribes. There was no concept of authors' copyright or royalties, so writers sold their manuscripts outright to printers for low prices. Freedom of press also did not exist, at least in the sense that we are familiar with these days. And so a lot of people were afraid of really expressing their opinions. It's also important to note that there was a government organization called the Stationers' Company, which was chartered in 1557, and that particular company was in charge of and was responsible for licensing books. And the works which were kind of sent to this company had to be approved by royal officials. So you couldn't really publish whatever you wanted. It had to be approved by royal officials. Despite these regulations, censorship focused mainly on religious and historical works rather than literature. So literary writers had it kind of easy compared to people who were writing religious texts or historical ones. So religious texts sold much better than plays or secular poetry. Another important note to highlight here is that women had no access to formal education still and were rarely taught to write, making any female author text from this period an extraordinary achievement against nearly impossible odds, because a lot of women just didn't know how to write. Let's talk about the Tudor style. So, whenever we talk about the Tudor dynasty, can we kind of pinpoint the exact style of writers who lived through this period and kind of had associations with the court? Let's talk about that. Renaissance literature came from a culture deeply trained in rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion through language. Writers used forms and patterns known as figures to create beauty and expressive power. Elizabethans had a taste for elaborate ornament in language, just as they did in clothing and furniture. While some writers like John Lyly created highly ornate prose, others really valued plainness of speech. Poetry often aspired to the complex pleasures of musical compositions with elaborate but perfectly regular designs. Elizabethans also admired form, control of the medium, and patterned surfaces. Many writers believed that the universe itself had the beauty, concord, and kind of the harmony that they needed to portray in poetry. So you didn't really have to do anything else. You didn't have to add anything else. If you just sat down and described the universe in its glory and beauty, that would be enough for the audiences. The period's literature often shows a sense of wonder as well, as if the world were being seen clearly for the first time ever. This could be expressed in kind of solemn ways or with humor and playfulness, as in like different works written by like Christopher Marlowe or other Renaissance writers. Renaissance poetry was less interested in realism than in the magical powers of exquisite craftsmanship. And all they were trying to do was to draw readers into imagined worlds. The most important genre of the period was obviously plays and the theater. So let's talk about the Elizabethan theater. Permanent, kind of freestanding public theaters in England date only from Shakespeare's lifetime onwards. For example, we have the theater, which was built in 1576. However, England did have a rich theatrical tradition which stretched back centuries, even, including biblical cycle plays, performances in town halls, for instance, and in noble houses, and even traveling companies with players who were under noble patronage, which means that there was like a noble person who was the patron of that theater company, and they were just like traveling performers. They would kind of travel all over the country and perform. So even though we do have like public theaters only dating from Shakespeare's kind of lifetime onwards, we did have theater even before the Elizabethan period. Around 1590, an extraordinary change transformed English drama with the arrival of Christopher Marlowe. He created and mastered a theatrical language which was to be copied by the writers of the preceding ages. He kind of perfected blank verse, which was far more expressive than earlier dramatic writing. Elizabethan theaters were oval shaped. If you want to learn about like the shape, you can just Google it, but I'm just going to like describe it to you real quick. Elizabethan theaters, as I said, were oval shaped, buildings with an unroofed yard for standing spectators, who were also called groundlings. There were also rising tiers of seating around the yard for, richer people. And they were also located outside of city limits to avoid London authorities who were hostile to theater. So that was the trick that they came up with. If they built their theaters outside of city limits, then city officials could not intervene and censor their works. Plays that were performed drew large crowds, but also faced opposition on grounds of like public health, crime, and moral corruption. And so people who really didn't like these theaters were accusing these like theater companies of saying, okay, you're bringing a lot of people together, so there's risk to public health, crime is going to happen, like pickpockets here and there, and also like moral corruption. You're showing them unholy stories which are going to corrupt their mind. And despite all of this, between the late 1560s to 1642, theaters were like super popular. But unfortunately, like after 1642, theaters were closed during the Civil War. But as I said, between the 1560s and the 1640s, there was like an estimated 50 million visits to London theaters, which is amazing. Like if you think about it, it's just mind-blowing. All right. So we talked about the theater as well. I just wanted to let you know that this was the most like popular genre in this period, and people really loved it. Anyway, by the late 1590s, everybody knew that Queen Elizabeth's long reign was coming to an end, and it was causing a lot of anxiety. She was childless, she was the last of her line, and Elizabeth had refused to name a successor. Though she continued to exercise authority and make speeches, she was clearly, as Raleigh put it, a lady surprised by time. She was coming to the end of her life. Her advisors secretly corresponded with James VI of Scotland, who succeeded her when she died. And that was on March 24th, 1603. England feared civil war but welcomed its new king with bonfires. However, within a few years, the English began to express nostalgia for the good Queen Bess, short for Elizabeth, and they looked back on her reign as a magnificent, high point in their nation's history and culture. This was a very brief, I would say, you could talk for hours, trying to include everything there is about the 16th century, but that's not what I'm here to do. I was just trying to give you a very general overview of the 16th century literature. If you're interested in learning more about it, I highly recommend buying Norton Anthology of English Literature, which is also the book that I'm using as a reference point for the PowerPoint presentations that I create. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you click subscribe and also give this video a thumbs up, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye-bye.